Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Read by Janette Miller. Chapter 7. A Mad Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. The Dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it and talking over its head. Very uncomfortable for the Dormouse, thought Alice, only as it's asleep, I suppose it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at a corner of it. "No room! No room! No room!" they cried out when they saw Alice coming. "There's plenty of room," said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. "Have some wine," the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all round the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. "I don't see any wine," she remarked. "There isn't any," said the March Hare. "Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it," said Alice angrily. "It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited," said the March Hare. "I didn't know it was your table," said Alice. "It's laid for a great many more than 3. "Your hair wants cutting," said the Hatter. He'd been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech. "You should learn not to make personal remarks," Alice said with some severity. "It's very rude." The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" "Come, we shall have some fun now," thought Alice. "I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that," she added out loud. "Do you mean you think you can find out the answer to it?" said the March Hare. "Exactly so," said Alice. "Then you should say what you mean," the March Hare went on. "I do," Alice hastily replied. "At least I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know." "Not the same thing a bit," said the Hatter. "Why? You might just as well say, 'I see what I eat' is the same thing as 'I eat what I see.'" "You might just as well say," added the March Hare, "that 'I like what I get' is the same thing as 'I get what I like.'" "You might just as well say," added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking in his sleep, "that 'I breathe when I sleep' is the same thing as 'I sleep when I breathe.'" "It is the same thing with you," said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. "What day of the month is it?" he said, turning to Alice. He'd taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then and holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little and said, "The 4th. "2 days wrong," sighed the Hatter. "I told you butter wouldn't suit the works," he added, looking angrily at the March Hare. "It was the best butter," the March Hare meekly replied. "Yes, but some crumbs must have got in as well," the Hatter grumbled. "You shouldn't have put it in with the bread knife." The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea and looked at it again. But he couldn't think of nothing better to say than his first remark. "It was the best butter, you know." Alice had been looking over his shoulder with curiosity. "What a funny watch," she remarked. "It tells the day of the month, and it doesn't tell what o'clock it is." "Why should it?" muttered the Hatter. "Does your watch tell you what year it is?" "Of course not," Alice replied very readily. But that's because it stays the same year for such a long time together. Which is just the case with mine, said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to her to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. I don't quite understand you, she said, as politely as she could. The Dormouse is asleep again, said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea onto its nose. The Dormouse shook its head impatiently and said without opening its eyes, Of course, I was just going to remark that myself. Have you guessed the riddle yet? The Hatter said, turning to Alice. No, I give it up, Alice replied. What's the answer? I haven't the slightest idea, said the Hatter. Nor I, said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. I think you might do something better with the time, she said, than wasting it in asking riddles that have no answers. If you knew time as well as I do, said the Hatter, you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him. I don't know what you mean, said Alice. Of course you don't, the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously. I dare say you've never even spoke to time. Perhaps not, Alice cautiously replied, but I know I have to beat time when I learn music. Ha! That accounts for it, said the Hatter. He won't stand beating. Now, if only you kept on good terms with him, he'd do almost anything you liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner. I only wish it was, said the Hare to itself in a whisper. That would be grand, certainly, said Alice thoughtfully. But then I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know. Not at first, perhaps, said the Hatter, but you could keep it to 1:30, as long as you like. Is that the way you manage? Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully. Not I, he replied. We quarrelled last March, just before he went mad, you know, pointing with his teaspoon at the March Hare. It was at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder what you're at. You know the song, perhaps. Well, I've heard something like it, said Alice. It goes on, you know, the Hatter continued, in this way. Up above the world you fly, like a tea-tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle. And here the Dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep. Twinkle, 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 twinkle. And it went on so long that they had to pinch it to make it stop. Well, I'd hardly finished the first verse, said the Hatter, when the Queen bawled out, He's murdering the time. Off with his head. How dreadfully savage, exclaimed Alice. And ever since that, the Hatter went on, in a mournful tone, he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now. A bright idea came into Alice's head. Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here? She asked. Yes, that's it, said the Hatter with a sigh. It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things up between whiles. Then you keep moving round, I suppose, said Alice. Exactly so, said the Hatter, as the things get used up. But when you come to the beginning again, Alice ventured to ask. Suppose we change the subject, the March Hare interrupted, yawning. I'm getting very tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story. I'm afraid I don't know one, said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal. Then the Dormouse shall, they both cried. Wake up, Dormouse, and they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes. I wasn't asleep, he said in a hoarse, feeble voice. I heard every word you fellows were saying. "Tell us a story," said the March Hare. "Oh, yes, please do," pleaded Alice. "And be quick about it," added the Hatter, "or you'll be asleep before it's done."
"Once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters," the Dormouse began in a great hurry, "and their names were Elsie, Lacie, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well."
"What did they live on?" said Alice, who always took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking.
"They lived on treacle," said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two.
"Oh, they couldn't have done that, you know," Alice gently remarked. "They'd have been ill."
"So they were," said the Dormouse, "very ill."
Alice tried a little to fancy herself what such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on, "And why did they live at the bottom of a well?"
"Take some more tea?"
the March Hare said to Alice very earnestly. "I've had nothing yet," Alice replied in an offended tone, "so I can't take any more." "You mean you can't take less," said the Hatter. "It's very easy to take more than nothing." "Nobody asked your opinion," said Alice. "Who's making personal remarks now?" the Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice didn't quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea and bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question. "Why did they live at the bottom of a well?" The Dormouse again took a minute or two to think about it, and then said,
"It was a treacle well."
"There's no such thing," Alice was beginning very angrily, but the Hatter and the March Hare went on, "Shh, shh, shh, shh," and the Dormouse sulkily remarked,
"If you can't be civil, you better finish the story yourself."
"Oh, no, please go on," Alice said very humbly. "I won't interrupt you again. I dare say there may be one."
"One indeed," said the Dormouse indignantly.
However, it consented to go on.
"And so these 3 little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know."
"What did they draw?" said Alice, quite forgetting her promise.
"Treacle,"
said the Dormouse, without considering at all this time. "I want a clean cup," interrupted the Hatter. "Let's all move one place on." And he moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him, and the March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice, rather unwillingly, took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug into his plate. Alice didn't wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously. "But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from?" "You can draw water out of a water well," said the Hatter. "So I think you could draw treacle out of a treacle well, eh, stupid?" "But they were in the well," Alice said to the Dormouse, not choosing to notice this last remark.
Of course they were," said the Dormouse. "Well in."
This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting it.
"They were learning to draw," the Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing its eyes, for it was getting very sleepy, "and they drew all manner of things. Everything that begins with an M."
"Why with an M?" said Alice.
"Why not?"
said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse had closed its eyes by this time and was going off into a doze, but on being pinched by the Hatter, it woke up again with a little "ah!" shriek and went on, "That begins with an M, such as mousetraps, and the moon, and memory, and muchness. You know, you say things are much of a muchness.
Did you ever see such a thing as a drawing of a muchness?"
"Really? Now you ask me," said Alice, very much confused. "I don't think—" "Then you shouldn't talk," said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping that they would call after her. And the last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot. "At any rate, I'll never go there again," said Alice, as she picked her way through the wood. "It's the stupidest tea party I was at in all my life." Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. "That's very curious," she thought. "But everything's curious today. I think I may as well go in at once." And in she went. Once more she found herself in the long hall and close to the little glass table. "Now, I'll manage better this time," she said to herself, and began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she set to work nibbling at the mushroom. She kept a piece of it in her pocket till she was about a foot high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. Chapter 8. The Queen's Croquet-Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, and there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought, "This is a very curious thing," and she went nearer to watch them. And just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say,
"Look out now, 5. Don't go splashing paint over me like that."
"I can't help it," said 5 in a sulky tone. 7 jogged my elbow." On which 7 looked up and said, That's right, 5. Always blame on the others." "You'd better not talk," said 5. "I've heard the Queen only said yesterday you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one spoken first. "None of your business too," said 7. "Yes, it's his business," said 5, "and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions." 7 flung down his brush and had just begun, "Well, of all the unjust things," when his eyes chanced on Alice, as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked round also, and all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me, please," said Alice a little timidly, "why you're painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose, and we put a white one in by mistake. And if the Queen was to find out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So you see, miss, we're doing our best afore she comes to—" At this moment, 5, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds, and walked 2 and 2, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along, hand in hand, in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognised the White Rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion, and last of all, in this grand procession, came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not to lie down on her face like the three gardeners, but she couldn't remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions, and besides, what would be the use of a procession, she thought, if people all had to lie down on their faces so they couldn't see it? So she stood still where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot," said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice, she went on, "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely. But she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards, after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" the Queen, pointing to the three gardeners who were lying round the rose tree. For you see, as they were lying on their faces, and the pattern on their backs was the same as the rest of the pack, she couldn't tell whether they were gardeners or soldiers or courtiers, or three of her own children. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." The Queen turned, crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment, like a wild beast, began screaming, "Off with her head! Off with her—" "Nonsense," said Alice very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand on her arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she's only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him and said to the Knave, "Turn them over." The Knave did so, very carefully, with one foot. "Get up," said the Queen in a shrill, loud voice, and the three gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King and the Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave that off," screamed the Queen. "You make me giddy." And then turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "May it please your Majesty," said two, in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke, "we were trying—" "I see," said the Queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. "Off with their heads." And the procession moved on, three of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran up to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The three soldiers wandered about for a minute or two, looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the Queen. "Their heads are gone, if you please, your Majesty," the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right. Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on, then," roared the Queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. "It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the White Rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Shh, shh," said the Rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear and whispered, "She's under sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say, 'What a pity'?" "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, 'What
4. She boxed the Queen's ears, the rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. Oh, shh, hush, the rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the Queen said, Get to your places, shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or two, and the game began. Alice thought she'd never seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The croquet balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets live flamingos. And the soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm, with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as she had got its neck nicely straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist itself around and look up into her face with such a puzzled expression that she couldn't help bursting out laughing. And when she got its head down and was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or a furrow in the way wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to. And, as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that this was a very difficult game indeed. All the players played at once, without waiting for turns, quarrelling all the while, and fighting for the hedgehogs. And in a very short time, the Queen was in a furious passion, and went stamping about and shouting, Off with his head! Or Off with her head! About once in a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy, and to be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute with the Queen, but she knew that it might happen any minute, and then she thought, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. And she was looking about for some way of escape, and wondering whether she could get away without being seen, and she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin, and she said to herself, It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have somebody to talk to. How are you getting on? Said the cat, as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared, and then nodded. It's no use speaking to it, she thought, till its ears have come out, or at least one of them. In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and begun an account of the game, feeling very glad that she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it in sight, and no more of it appeared. I don't think they play at all fairly, Alice began, in a rather complaining tone, and they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least, if there are, nobody attends to them. You've no idea how confusing it all is. It's all the things being alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through next, walking about at the other end of the ground, and I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming. How do you like the Queen? Said the cat in a low voice. Not at all, said Alice. She's so extremely. Just then she noticed that the Queen was close behind her listening, so she went on, likely to win, that it's hardly worth while finishing the game. The Queen smiled and passed on. Who are you talking to? Said the King, coming up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. It's a friend of mine,
"A Cheshire cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce it."
I don't like the look of it at all," said the king. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes."
"I'd rather not," the cat remarked.
"Don't be impertinent," said the king,
"and don't look at me like that."
He got behind Alice as he spoke. "A cat may look at a king," said Alice. "I've read that in some book, but I don't remember where."
"Well, it must be removed," said the king very decidedly, and he called to the queen, who was passing at the moment. "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." The queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. "Off with his head," she said, without even looking round. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," said the king eagerly, and he hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on, as she heard the queen's voice in the distance screaming with passion. She'd already heard her sentence 3 of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she didn't like the look of things at all, as the game was in such confusion that she never thought whether it was her turn or not. So she went off in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across to the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it trying in a helpless sort of way to fly up into a tree. By the time she caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over, and both the hedgehogs were out of sight. "Oh, but it doesn't matter much," thought Alice, as all the archers are gone from this side of the ground. So she tucked it away under her arm, that it might not escape again, and went back to have a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected around it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the king, and the queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were quite silent, and all looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she was appealed to by all 3 to settle the question, and they repeated their arguments to her. Though, as they all spoke at once, she found it very hard to make out exactly what they said. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from, that he'd never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't to talk nonsense. The queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody executed all round. It was this last remark that made the whole party look so grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say but, "It belongs to the Duchess. You better ask her about it." "She is in prison," the Queen said to the executioner. "Fetch her here." And the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and by the time he'd come back with the Duchess, it had entirely disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game. Chapter 9. The Mock Turtle's Story. "You can't think how glad I am to see you again, you dear old thing," said the Duchess, as she tucked her arm affectionately into Alice's, and they walked off together. Alice was very glad to find her in such a pleasant temper, and thought to herself that perhaps it was only the pepper that had made her so savage when they met in the kitchen. "When I'm a duchess," she said to herself, not in a very hopeful tone though, "I won't have any pepper in my kitchen at all, Soup does very well without. Maybe it's always pepper that makes people so hot-tempered, she went on, very much pleased at having found out a new rule, and vinegar that makes them sour, and chamomile that makes them bitter, and barley sugar, and such things that make children sweet-tempered. Oh, I only wish people knew that. Then they wouldn't be so stingy about it, you know. She'd quite forgotten the Duchess by this time, and was a little startled when she heard her voice close to her ear. "You're thinking about something, my dear, and that makes you forget to talk. I can't tell you just now what the moral of that is, but I shall remember it in a bit." "Perhaps it hasn't one," Alice ventured to remark. "Tut, tut, child," said the Duchess. "Everything's got a moral, if only you can find it." And she squeezed herself up closer to Alice's side as she spoke. Alice did not much like her keeping so close to her, at first because the Duchess was very ugly, and secondly because she was exactly the right height to rest her chin on Alice's shoulder, and it was an uncomfortably sharp chin. However, she didn't like to be rude, so she bore it as well as she could. "The game's going on rather better now," she said, by the way of keeping up the conversation a little. "'Tis so," said the Duchess, "and the moral of that is, oh, 'tis love, that makes the world go round." "Somebody said," whispered Alice, "that it's done by everybody minding their own business." "Ah, well, it means much the same thing," said the Duchess, digging her sharp little chin into Alice's shoulder, as she added, "and the moral of that is, take care of the sense, and the sounds will take care of themselves." How fond she is of finding morals in things, Alice thought to herself. "I dare say you're wondering why I don't put my arm round your waist," said the Duchess after a pause. "The reason is that I'm doubtful about the temper of your flamingo. Shall I try the experiment?" "He might bite," Alice cautiously replied, not feeling at all anxious to have the experiment tried. "Very true," said the Duchess. "Flamingos and mustard both bite, and the moral of that is, birds of a feather flock together." "Only mustard isn't a bird," Alice remarked. "Right as usual," said the Duchess. "What a clear way you have of putting things." "It's a mineral, I think," said Alice. "Of course it is," said the Duchess, who seemed ready to agree to everything that Alice said. "There's a large mustard mine near here, and the moral of that is, the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours." "Oh, I know," exclaimed Alice, who had not attended to this last remark. "It's a vegetable. Doesn't look like one, but it is." "Oh, I agree with you," said the Duchess, "and the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be, or if you'd like it put more simply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others that what you were, or might have been, was not otherwise than what you had been would have appeared to them to be otherwise." "I think I should understand that better," Alice said very politely, "if I had it written down. But I can't quite follow it as you say it." "Oh, that's nothing to what I could say if I chose," the Duchess replied in a pleased tone. "Pray don't trouble yourself to say it any longer than that," said Alice. "Oh, don't talk about trouble," said the Duchess. "I make you a present of everything I've said as yet." A cheap sort of present, thought Alice. I'm glad they don't give birthday presents like that. But she didn't venture to say it out loud. "Thinking again?" the Duchess asked, with another dig of her sharp little chin. "I've a right to think," said Alice sharply, for she was beginning to feel a little worried. "Just about as much right," said the Duchess, "as pigs have to fly, and the more—" Here, to the Alice's great surprise, the Duchess's voice died away, even in the middle of her favourite word, moral. and the arm that was linked into hers began to tremble. Alice looked up, and there stood the Queen in front of them, with her arms folded, frowning like a thunderstorm. "Oh, a fine day, Your Majesty," the Duchess began in a low, weak voice. "Now, I give you fair warning," shouted the Queen, stamping on the ground as she spoke. "Either you or your head must be off, and that in about half no time. Take your choice." The Duchess took her choice and was gone in a moment. "Let's get on with the game," the Queen said to Alice, and Alice was much too frightened to say a word, but slowly followed her back to the croquet-ground. The other guests had taken advantage of the Queen's absence and were resting in the shade. However, the moment they saw her, they hurried back to the game, the Queen merely remarking that a moment's delay would cost them their lives. All the time they were playing, the Queen never left off quarrelling with the other players and shouting, "Off with his head!" or "Off with her head!" Those whom she sentenced were taken into custody by the soldiers, who of course had to leave off being archers to do this, so that by the end of half an hour or so there were no archers left, and all the players, except the King, the Queen, and Alice, were in custody and under sentence of execution. The Queen left off, quite out of breath, and said to Alice, "Have you seen the mock turtle yet?" "No," said Alice. "I don't even know what a mock turtle is." "It's the thing they make mock turtle soup from," said the Queen. "I never saw one or heard of one," said Alice. "Come on, then," said the Queen, "and he shall tell you his history." As they walked off together, Alice heard the King say in a low voice to the company generally, "You are all pardoned." "Come, that's a good thing," she said to herself, for she had felt quite unhappy at the number of executions the Queen had ordered. They very soon came upon a Gryphon lying asleep in a sun. Now, if you don't know what a Gryphon is, look at a picture. "Up, lazy thing," said the Queen, "and take this young lady to see the mock turtle, and to hear its history. I must go back and see after some executions I've ordered." And she walked off, leaving Alice alone with the Gryphon. Alice didn't quite like the look of the creature, but on the whole she thought it would be quite as safe to stay with it as to go after that savage Queen. So she waited. The Gryphon sat up and rubbed its eyes. Then it watched the Queen till she was out of sight. Then it chuckled. "What fun!" said the Gryphon, half to itself, half to Alice. "What is the fun?" said Alice. "Why, she. It's all her fancy, that. They never executes nobody, you know. Come on." Everybody says "come on" here, thought Alice, as she went slowly after it. "I was never so ordered about before in all my life. Never." They'd not gone far before they saw the mock turtle in the distance, sitting sad and lonely on a little ledge of rock. And as they came nearer, Alice could hear him singing, as if his heart would break. She pitied him deeply. "What is his sorrow?" she asked the Gryphon. And the Gryphon answered, very nearly in the same words as before, "It's all his fancy, that. He ain't got no sorrow, you know. Come on." So they went up to the mock turtle, who looked at them with large eyes, full of tears, but said nothing. "This here's a young lady," said the Gryphon. "She wants for to know your history, she do." "I'll tell it to her," said the mock turtle, in a deep, hollow tone. "Sit down, both of you, and don't speak a word till I've finished." So she sat down, and nobody spoke for some minutes. Alice thought to herself, "Don't see how he can ever finish if he doesn't begin." But she waited patiently. "Once," said the mock turtle at last, with a deep sigh, "I was a real turtle." These words were followed by a very long silence, broken only by an occasional exclamation of from the Gryphon, and the constant heavy sobbing of the mock turtle. Alice was very nearly getting up and saying, "Thank you, sir, for your interesting story." But she couldn't help thinking that there must be more to come, and so she sat still and said nothing.
"When we were little," the Mock Turtle went on at last, more calmly, though still sobbing a little now and then, "we went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise."
"Why did you call him Tortoise if he wasn't one?" Alice asked.
"We called him Tortoise because he taught us," said the Mock Turtle angrily. "Really, you are very dull."
"You ought to be ashamed of yourself for asking such a simple question," added the Gryphon. And then they both sat silent and looked at poor Alice, who felt ready to sink into the earth. At last the Gryphon said to the Mock Turtle, "Drive on, old fella. Don't be all day about it." And he went on in these words.
"Yes, we went to school in the sea, though you mayn't believe it."
"I never said I didn't," interrupted Alice.
"You did,"
said the Mock Turtle. "Hold your tongue," added the Gryphon, before Alice could speak again. And the Mock Turtle went on.
"We had the best of educations. In fact, we went to school every day."
"I've been to a day school too," said Alice. "You needn't be so proud as all that."
"With extras?"
said the Mock Turtle, a little anxiously. "Yes," said Alice. "We learned French and music." "And washing?" said the Mock Turtle. "Oh, certainly not," said Alice indignantly.
"Ah, then yours wasn't a really good school," said the Mock Turtle in a tone of great relief. "Now at ours, they had at the end of the bill French, music, and washing extra."
"You couldn't have wanted it much," said Alice, "living at the bottom of the sea."
"I couldn't afford to learn it," said the Mock Turtle with a sigh. "I only took the regular course."
"What was that?" inquired Alice.
"Reeling and writhing, of course, to begin with," the Mock Turtle replied, "and then the different branches of arithmetic: ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision."
"I've never heard of uglification," Alice ventured to say. "What is it?" The Gryphon lifted up both its paws in surprise.
"Never heard of uglifying?" it exclaimed. "You know what to beautify is, I suppose?"
"Yes," said Alice doubtfully. "It means to make anything prettier."
"Well then," the Gryphon went on, "if you don't know what to uglify is, you're a simpleton."
Alice did not feel encouraged to ask any more questions about it, so she turned to the Mock Turtle and said, "And what else had you to learn?"
"Well, there was mystery," the Mock Turtle replied, counting off the subjects on his flappers. "Mystery, ancient and modern, with seography, then drawling. The drawling master was an old conger eel that used to come once a week. He taught us drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils."
"What was that like?" said Alice.
"Well, I can't show it to you myself," the Mock Turtle said. "I'm too stiff, and the Gryphon never learnt it." "Hadn't the time," said the Gryphon. "I went to the classical master, though. He was an old grab, he was."
"I never went to him,"
said the Mock Turtle with a sigh. "He taught laughing and grief, they used to say." "So he did,
said the Gryphon, sighing in his turn, and both creatures hid their faces in their paws. "And how many hours a day did you do lessons?" said Alice, in a hurry to change the subject.
10 hours the first day," said the Mock Turtle. 9 the next, and so on."
"What a curious plan!" exclaimed Alice.
"That's the reason they're called lessons," the Gryphon remarked, "because they lessen from day to day."
This was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little before she made her next remark. "Then the 11th day must have been a holiday?"
"Of course it was," said the Mock Turtle.
"How did you manage on the 12th?" Alice went on eagerly.
"That's enough about lessons," the Gryphon interrupted in a very decided tone. "Tell us something about the games now."
Chapter 10. The Lobster Quadrille. Turtle sighed deeply and drew the back of one flapper across his eyes. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a minute or two sobs choked his voice. "Same as if he had a bone in his throat," said the Gryphon, and it set to work shaking him and punching him in the back. At last the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and with tears running down his cheeks, he went on again. "You may not have lived much under the sea." "I haven't," said Alice. "And perhaps you were never introduced to a lobster." Alice began to say, "I once tasted a," but checked herself hastily and said, "No, never." "So you can have no idea what a delightful thing a lobster quadrille is." "No, indeed," said Alice. "What sort of dance is it?" "Why," said the Gryphon, "you first form into a line along the seashore." "2 lines," cried the Mock Turtle. "Seals, turtles, salmon, so on. Then, when you've cleared all the jellyfish out of the way—" "That generally takes some time," interrupted the Gryphon. "You advance twice, each with a lobster as a partner," said the Gryphon. "Of course," the Mock Turtle said. "Advance twice, set to partners." "Change lobsters and retire in same order," continued the Gryphon. "Then, you know," the Mock Turtle went on, "you throw the lobsters," shouted the Gryphon, with a bound into the air, "as far out to sea as you can." "Swim after them," screamed the Gryphon. "Turn a somersault in the sea," cried the Mock Turtle, capering wildly about. "Change lobsters again," yelled the Gryphon. "Back to land. And that's all the first figure," said the Mock Turtle, suddenly dropping his voice. And the 2 creatures, who had been jumping about like mad things all this time, sat down again, very sadly and quietly, and looked at Alice. "It must have been a very pretty dance," said Alice timidly. "Would you like to see a little of it?" said the Mock Turtle. "Oh, very much indeed," said Alice. "Come on, let's try the first figure," said the Mock Turtle to the Gryphon. "We can do it without lobsters, you know. Which shall sing?" "Oh, you sing," said the Gryphon. "I've forgotten the words." So they began solemnly dancing round and round Alice, every now and then treading on her toes when they passed too close, and waving their forepaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang this very slowly and sadly. "Will you walk a little faster?" said the Whiting to the Snail. "There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? Will you, won't you join the dance? You really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us, with the lobsters, out to sea." But the Snail replied, "Too far," and gave a look askance, said he thanked the Whiting kindly, but he would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not join the dance. Would not, could not join the dance. "What matters it how far we go?" his scaly friend replied. "There is another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further off from England, the nearer is to France. Then turn not pale, beloved Snail, but come and join the dance. Will you, won't you join the dance? Will you, won't you join the dance?" "Oh, thank you. It's a very interesting dance to watch," said Alice, feeling very glad that it was over at last. "I do so like that curious song about the Whiting." As to the Whiting," said the Mock Turtle, you've seen them, of course." "Oh, yes," said Alice. "I've often seen them at dinner." She checked herself hastily. "I don't know where Din may be," said the Mock Turtle, "but if you've seen them so often,
You know, of course, what they're like.
I believe so, Alice replied thoughtfully. They have their tails in their mouth, and they're all over crumbs.
You're wrong about the crumbs, said the Mock Turtle. Crumbs would all wash off in the sea. But they have their tails in their mouths, and the reason is...
Here the Mock Turtle yawned and shut his eyes.
Tell her about the reason and all that, he said to the Gryphon. Well, the reason is, said the Gryphon, that they would go with lobsters to the dance, so they got thrown out to sea. They had to fall a long way, so they got their tails fast in their mouths, so they couldn't get them out again. That's all.
Thank you, said Alice. It's very interesting. I never knew so much about a whiting before.
I can tell you more if you like, said the Gryphon. Do you know why they're called a whiting?
Well, I never thought about it, said Alice. Why?
It does the boots and shoes, the Gryphon replied very solemnly.
Alice was thoroughly puzzled. Does the boots and shoes? She repeated in a wondering tone.
Why, what are your shoes done with? Asked the Gryphon. I mean, what makes them so shiny?
Alice looked down at them and considered a little before she gave her answer. Well, they're done with blacking, I believe.
Boots and shoes under the sea, the Gryphon went on in a deep voice, are done with whiting. Now, you know.
And what are they made of? Alice asked in a tone of great curiosity.
Soles and eels, of course, the Gryphon replied, rather impatiently. Any shrimp could have told you that.
If I'd been the whiting, said Alice, whose thoughts were still running on the song, I'd have said to the porpoise, keep back, please. We don't want you with us.
They were obliged to have him with them, the Mock Turtle said. No wise fish would go anywhere without a porpoise.
Wouldn't it really? Said Alice in a tone of great surprise.
Of course not, said the Mock Turtle. Why, if a fish came to me and told me he was going on a journey, I should say, with what purpose?
Don't you mean purpose? Said Alice.
I mean what I say, the Mock Turtle replied, in an offended tone, and the Gryphon added, Come on, let's hear some of your adventures.
I could tell you my adventures beginning from this morning, said Alice a little timidly, but it's no use going back to yesterday, because I was a different person then.
Explain all that, said the Mock Turtle.
Nah, the adventures first, said the Gryphon in an impatient tone.
Explanations take such a dreadful time.
So Alice began telling them her adventures from the time when she first saw the white rabbit. She was a little nervous about it at first. The two creatures got so close to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouths so very wide, but she gained courage as she went on. Her listeners were perfectly quiet till she got to the bit about her repeating, You are old, Father William, to the caterpillar, and the words all coming out different. And then the Mock Turtle drew a long breath and said,
That's very curious.
It's all about as curious as it can be, said the Gryphon.
It all came different, the Mock Turtle repeated thoughtfully. I should like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her to begin.
He looked at the Gryphon as if he thought it had some kind of authority over Alice.
Stand up and repeat, "'Tis the voice of the sluggard," said the Gryphon.
How the creatures order one about and make one repeat lessons, thought Alice. I might just as well be at school at once. However, she got up and began to repeat it, but her head was so full of the lobster could drill that she hardly knew what she was saying, and the words came out very peculiar indeed. "'Tis the voice of the lobster," I heard him declare. "You have baked me too brown, I must sugar my hair. As a duck with its eyelids, so he, with his nose, trims his belt and his buttons and turns out his toes. When the sands are all dry, he is gay as a lark, and will talk in contemptuous tones of the shark. But when the tide rises,
and sharks are around, his voice has a timid and tremulous sound.
Oh, I say that's different from what I used to say it when I was a child, said the Gryphon.
Well, I've never heard it before, said the Mock Turtle, but it sounds uncommon nonsense.
Alice said nothing, and she sat down again with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would ever happen in a natural way again.
I should like to have it explained, said the Mock Turtle.
Well, she can't explain it, said the Gryphon hastily. Go on with the next verse.
But about his toes, the Mock Turtle persisted. How could he turn them out with his nose, you know?
It's the first position in dancing, Alice said. But she was dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing and longed to change the subject. Go on with the next verse, the Gryphon repeated impatiently. It begins, I passed by his garden. Alice did not dare to disobey, though she felt it would be all wrong, and she went on in a trembling voice. I passed by his garden and marked with one eye how the owl and the panther were sharing a pie. The panther took pie crust and gravy and meat, while the owl had the dish as its share of the treat. When the pie was all finished, the owl, as a boon, was kindly permitted to pocket the spoon, while the panther received knife and fork with a growl, and concluded the banquet by—
What's the use of repeating all that stuff? The Mock Turtle interrupted. If you don't explain it as you go on, it's by far the most confusing thing I ever heard.
Yep, you better leave off, said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so. Shall we try another figure of the Lobster quadrille? The Gryphon went on. Or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you a song? Oh, song, please. If the Mock Turtle would be so kind, Alice replied so eagerly that the Gryphon said, in rather an offended tone, accounting for taste, then. Sing a turtle soup, will you, me old fella? The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and began, in a voice sometimes choked with songs, to sing, Beautiful soup, so rich and green, awaiting in a hot tureen. Who for such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not give all else for 2 pennyworth only of beautiful soup? Pennyworth only of beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Chorus again, cried the Gryphon, and the Mock Turtle had just begun to repeat it when a cry of, Yo, yeah, the trial's beginning, was heard in the distance. Come on, cried the Gryphon, and taking Alice by the hand, it hurried off without waiting for the end of the song. What trial is it? Alice panted as she ran, but the Gryphon only answered, Come on, and ran the faster, while more and more faintly came, carried on the breeze that followed them, the melancholy words, Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Chapter 11. Who Stole the Tarts? The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as a whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chains, with a soldier on each side to guard him, and near the king was the white rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table, with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good that it made Alice quite hungry to look at them. I wish they'd get the trial done, she thought, and hand round the refreshments. But there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass away the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she'd read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find that she knew the name of nearly everything there. That's the judge, she said to herself, because of his great wig. The judge, by the way, was the king, and he wore his crown over the wig. He did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not becoming. And that's the jury box, thought Alice, and those 12 creatures. She was obliged to say creatures, you see, because some of them were animals and some were birds. I suppose they are the jurors, she said, this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself, being rather proud of it. For she thought, and rightly too, that very few little girls of her age knew the meaning of it at all. However, jurymen would have done just as well. The 12 jurors were all writing very busily on slates. "What are they doing?" Alice whispered to the Gryphon. "They can't have anything to put down yet, before the trial's begun."
"Oh, they're putting down their names,"
the Gryphon whispered in reply,
"for fear they should forget 'em before the end of the trial."
"Stupid things," Alice began in a loud, indignant voice, but she stopped herself hastily, for the white rabbit cried out, "Silence in court!" And the king put on his spectacles and looked around anxiously to make out who was talking. Alice could see, as well as if she were looking over their shoulders, that all the jurors were writing down stupid things on their slates, and she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell stupid, and that he had to ask his neighbour to tell him. A nice muddle their slates'll be in before the trial's over, thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked. This, of course, Alice couldn't stand, and she went round the court and got behind him, and very soon found an opportunity of taking it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little juror, it was Bill the lizard, couldn't make out at all what had become of it. So after hunting about for it, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day, and this was of very little use, as it left no mark on the slate.
"Herald, read the accusation," said the king.
On this, the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet, and then unrolled the parchment scroll and read as follows.
"The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and took them quite away. Consider your verdict," the king said to the jury.
Not yet, the rabbit hastily interrupted. "There's a great deal to come before that."
"Call the first witness,"
said the king, and the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet and called out, "First witness." The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other.
"I beg your pardon, Majesty," he began, "for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for."
"You ought to have finished," said the king. "When did you begin?" The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse.
14th of March, I think it was," he said.
15th, said the March Hare.
16th,
added the Dormouse. "Write that down," said the king to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates, and then added them up and reduced the answer to shillings and pence.
"Take off your hat,"
the king said to the Hatter.
"It isn't mine," said the Hatter.
Stolen? The king exclaimed, turning to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact. I keep them to sell, the hatter added as an explanation. I've none of my own. I'm a hatter. Here the queen put on her spectacles and began staring hard at the hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted. Give your evidence, said the king, and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot. This didn't seem to encourage the witness at all. He kept shifting from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of the bread and butter. Just at this moment Alice felt a very curious sensation, which puzzled her a good deal until she'd made out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, but on second thoughts she decided to remain where she was as long as there was room for her. I wish you wouldn't squeeze so, said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her. I could hardly breathe. I can't help it, said Alice very meekly. I'm growing. You've no right to grow here, said the Dormouse. Oh, don't talk nonsense, said Alice more boldly. You know you're growing too. Yes, but I grow at a reasonable rate, said the Dormouse, not in that ridiculous fashion. And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time the queen had never left off staring at the hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court, she said to one of the officers of the court, Bring me the list of singers in the last concert. On which the wretched hatter trembled so that he shook both of his shoes off. Give your evidence, the king repeated angrily, or I'll have you executed, whether you're nervous or not. I'm a poor man, your majesty, the hatter began in a trembling voice, and I hadn't but just begun my tea, not above a week or so, and what with the bread and butter getting so thin, and the twinkling of the tea. The twinkling of the what? Said the king. It began with the tea, the hatter replied. Of course twinkling begins with a tea, said the king sharply. Do you take me for a dunce? Go on. I'm a poor man, the hatter went on, and most things twinkled after that. Only the March Hare said— I didn't, the March Hare interrupted in a great hurry. You did, said the hatter. I deny it, said the March Hare. He denies it, said the king. Leave out that part. Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said— the hatter went on, looking anxiously around to see if he would deny it too, but the Dormouse denied nothing, being fast asleep. After that, continued the hatter, I cut some more bread and butter and— But what did the Dormouse say? One of the jury asked. That I can't remember, said the hatter. You must remember, remarked the king, or I'll have you executed. The miserable hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter and went down on one knee. I'm a poor man, your majesty, he began. You're a very poor speaker, said the king. Here one of the guinea pigs cheered and was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. As that is a rather hard word, I'll explain to you how it was done. They had a large canvas bag which tied up at the mouth with strings. Into this they slipped the guinea pig, head first, and then they sat upon it. Well, I'm glad to have seen that done, thought Alice. I've so often read it in newspapers at the end of trials. There was some attempt at applause, which was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. I never understood what it meant until now. If that's all you know about it, you may stand down, continued the king. I can't get no lower, said the hatter. I'm on the floor as it is.
Then you may sit down, the king replied. Here the other guinea pig cheered and was suppressed. Come, that finishes the guinea pigs, thought Alice. Now we shall get on better.
I'd rather finish my tea, said the Hatter, with an anxious look at the Queen,
who was reading the list of singers. You may go, said the king, and the Hatter hurriedly left the court without even waiting to put his shoes on.
And just take his head off outside,
the Queen added to one of the officers, but the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door.
Call the next witness, said the king.
The next witness was the Duchess's cook. She carried the pepper box in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was even before she got into court, by the way the people near the door began sneezing all at once.
Give your evidence, said the king.
Shan't, said the cook. The king looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness.
Well, if I must, said the king with a melancholy air,
and after folding his arms and frowning at the cook till his eyes were nearly out of sight, he said in a deep voice,
What are the tarts made of?
Pepper, mostly, said the cook.
Treacle,
said a sleepy voice behind her.
Collar that dormouse, the Queen shrieked out. Behead that dormouse. Turn the dormouse out of court. Suppress him, pinch him, off with his whiskers.
For some minutes the whole court was in confusion, getting the dormouse turned out, and by the time they settled down again, the cook had disappeared.
Never mind, said the king with an air of great relief. Call the next witness.
And he added in an undertone to the Queen,
Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. It quite makes my forehead ache.
Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like. They haven't got much evidence yet, she said to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his shrill little voice the name Alice. Chapter 12. Alice's Evidence. Here, cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she'd grown in the last few minutes, and she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen onto the heads of the crowd below. And there they lay, sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of goldfish she'd accidentally upset the week before. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay, and began picking them up again as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box, or they would die. "The trial cannot proceed," said the king in a very grave voice, "until all the jurymen are back in their proper places. All," he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he said so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that, in her haste, she'd put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a melancholy way, being quite unable to move. She soon got it out again and put it right. "Not that it signifies much," she said to herself. "I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial, up one way, as the other." As soon as the jury had a little recovered from the shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident. All except the lizard, who seemed to be too much overcome to do anything
but sit with its mouth open, gazing up into the roof of the court. "What do you know about this business?" the king said to Alice. "Nothing," said Alice. "Nothing whatever?" persisted the king. "Nothing whatever," said Alice. "That's very important," the king said, turning to the jury. They were just beginning to write this down on their slates when the White Rabbit interrupted. "Unimportant, Your Majesty, means, of course," he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him as he spoke. "Unimportant, of course, I meant," the king hastily said, and went on to himself in an undertone. "Important, unimportant, unimportant, important," as if we were trying which word sounded best. Some of the jury wrote it down, important, and some unimportant. Alice could see this as she was near enough to look over their slates. But it doesn't matter a bit, she thought to herself. At this moment, the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, called out, "Silence!" and read out from his book, "Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high to leave the court." Everybody looked at Alice. "I'm not a mile high," said Alice. "You are," said the king. "Nearly 2 miles high," added the queen. "Well, I shan't go at any rate," said Alice. "Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now." "It's the oldest rule in the book," said the king. "Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. "Consider your verdict," he said to the jury in a low, trembling voice. "There's more evidence to come yet, please, Your Majesty," said the White Rabbit, jumping up in a great hurry. "This paper has just been picked up." "What's in it?" said the Queen. I haven't opened it yet," said the White Rabbit, "but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody." "It must have been that," said the king, "unless it was written to nobody, which isn't usual, you know." "Who is it directed to?" said one of the jurymen. "It isn't directed at all," said the White Rabbit. "In fact, there's nothing written on the outside." He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added, "It isn't a letter after all. It's a set of verses." "Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?" "No, they're not," said the White Rabbit, "and that's the peculiar thing about it." The jury all looked puzzled. "He must have imitated somebody else's hand," said the king. The jury all brightened up again. "Please, Your Majesty," said the name, "I didn't write it, and they can't prove I did. There's no name signed at the end." "If you didn't sign it," said the king, "that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd have signed your name like an honest man." There was a general clapping of hands at this. It was the first really clever thing the king had said all that day. "It proves his guilt," said the queen. "It proves nothing of the sort," said Alice. "Why, you don't even know what they're about." "Read them," said the king. The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. "Where shall I begin, Your Majesty?" he asked. "Begin at the beginning," the king said gravely, "and go on until you come to the end. Then stop." These were the verses the White Rabbit read. "They told me you had been to her, and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I couldn't swim. He sent them word I had not gone. We know that to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1, they gave him 2, you gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free exactly as we were. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him and ourselves and it.
Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest between yourself and me." "That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet," said the king, rubbing his hands. "Now let the jury—" "If any one of them can explain it," said Alice. She had grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him. "I'll give him 6pence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it." The jury all wrote down on their slates, "She doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it." But none of them attempted to explain the paper. "If there's no meaning in it," said the king, "that saves a world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. And yet, I don't know," he went on, spreading out the verses on his knee and looking at them all with one eye. "I seem to see some meaning in it. After all, said I could not swim? You can't swim, can you?" he added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. "Do I look like it?" he said, which he certainly didn't, being made entirely of cardboard. "All right, so far," said the king, and he went on muttering over the verses to himself. "We knew it to be true. That's the jury, of course. I gave her 1, they gave him 2. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, you know." "But it goes on, they all returned from him to you," said Alice. "Why, there they are," said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. "Nothing could be clearer than that. Then again, before she had this fit—" "You never had fits, my dear, I think?" he said to the queen. "Never," said the queen furiously, throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill had left off writing on his slate with one finger, as he found it made no mark. But now he hastily began again, using the ink that was trickling down his face, as long as it lasted. "Then the words don't fit you," said the king, looking round at court with a smile. There was a dead silence. "It's a pun," the king added in an angry tone, and everybody laughed. "Let the jury consider their verdict," the king said for about the 20th time that day. "No, no," said the queen. "Sentence first, verdict afterwards." "Oh, stuff and nonsense," said Alice loudly. "The idea of having the sentence first." "Hold your tongue," said the queen, turning purple. "I won't," said Alice. "Off with her head," the queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. "Who cares for you?" said Alice. She'd grown to her full size by this time. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." At this, the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off. And she found herself lying on the bank, with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the trees onto her face. "Wake up, Alice dear," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you've had." "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," said Alice, and she told her sister, as well as she could remember them, all the strange adventures of hers that you have been just reading about. And when she had finished, her sister kissed her and said, "It was a curious dream, dear, certainly. But now run into your tea. It's getting late." So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well she might, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still, just as she left her, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun, and thinking of little Alice and all her wonderful adventures, till she, too, began dreaming after a fashion. And this was her dream. First, she dreamed of little Alice herself, Once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and the bright, eager eyes were looking up into hers, and she could hear the very tones of her voice, and see that strange little toss of her head keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still, as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place around her became alive with the strange creatures of her little sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighbouring pool. She could hear the rattle of the teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the Queen ordering off her unfortunate guests to execution. Once more the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while the plates and dishes crashed around it. Once more the shriek of the Gryphon, the squeaking of the lizard's slate pencil, and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs filled the air, mixed up with the distant sob of the miserable mock turtle. So she sat with closed eyes and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she had but to open them again and it would all change to dull reality. The grass would only be rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds, and the rattling teacups would change to the tinkling sheep bells, and the Queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy, and the sneeze of the baby, the shriek of the Gryphon, and all the other strange noises would change, she knew, to the confused clamour of the busy farmyard, where the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all the riper years, the simple loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children and make their eyes bright and eager with the many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and happy summer days.